Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to the 4 Nf3 variation video of the Czech Pirc. We can reach our main position here of this video after e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, which begins the Czech Pirc, and 4 knight f3. The most natural move in the position, also probably the most common, especially at the lower levels of play, just because it's a simple developing move. This move can be critical, especially because the move that I recommend is bishop to g4, and we can reach some critical positions where that arise after white chases around our bishop a bit. So if those positions are critical, why am I recommending this move? Because we are aiming for a e6 d5 setup where we can reach a favorable, let's say French or Caro-Kann structure where our bishop is outside of the pawn chain. I think that these positions in this method of playing is favorable to, let's say, playing for something more common to the Philidor or Pirc with e5, definitely more than the Philidor style, because we've played kind of some early strange moves that don't mix well with the Philidor. We'd be bending over backwards to reach a mainline position where, probably we're just worse. And here, when we play for e6 and d5, we're fighting for a strategic advantage where if we can achieve some sort of French position, we've got all the... It doesn't really matter that we spend these moves because the position will be locked and slower, and it will matter more that our pieces are well placed. So the moves I'm going to be covering in this video here, or the main variations I should say, are all three of the bishop movements and h3. And I'll cover very briefly, or at least I'll talk about very briefly, what happens if white does something with this bishop. The reason why the dark square bishop movements aren't very popular and why I'm not going to bother really looking into them is because it doesn't really hinder at all our plan of playing for e6 and d5, even in the most critical lines where the bishop comes to g5 and maybe tries to keep us from playing d5 by threatening to play e5 in response. And it's just not, especially if bishop comes to any of these other squares, we just play for e6 and d5 and we're very, very happy. After bishop to g5, we can play e6 anyways. Here, if white even holds off on playing any movement in the center, we just play e7, bishop e7 before playing d5, and we're absolutely fine. And if white plays e5 themselves, well, we can just take, and very nicely we can trade queens so that we can move our knight. So I wouldn't worry at all about any movement with the dark square bishop. Instead, we're going to go into the lines with the light square bishop. And in most of these lines, we're going to not have the inclusion of h3 right away, because we'll see that when we start with h3. There's a lot of transpositional possibilities between these moves just because it's a very flexible position. And so don't worry too much about the specifics here of, or let's say differences between bishop e2 and h3. There's just a lot of crossover. So I'll start by looking at these positions where the bishop is played without any sort of h3 move, and then we'll look into what happens if h3 is present in the position. I'm going to start with bishop c4. Bishop c4 is the worst of the bishop movements, very simply because we're going to play for d5 anyways, and they're just encouraging us to do so. And when we do get d5 in, we're going to get this extra tempo on the bishop on c4, and that's going to make white feel a little silly for choosing this square for the bishop. After e6, I should mention it is possible for white to play d5 themselves. We're going to see this in a lot of the other positions, and I'm not going to look into it here since we'll see it plenty of times. And I'll just leave it off by saying that the bishop on c4 isn't so ideally placed compared to some of the other positions where maybe it breaks the pin. And any of the knowledge that you gain in the other positions where white plays d5 will suffice for this position as well. Instead here I'm going to look at one, let's say, critical variation after bishop to b3. Of course we play for d5. If they play e5, well then we get exactly what we want and go into this favorable French structure where we can play for c5. The extra tempo we lose on playing d6 before d5 and c6 before c5, we're invested in this bishop coming to b3, which is not ideal at all for the bishop in these French structures. So don't worry about the loss of time in closed position. The placement of the pieces are much more important. So that'd be very nice to see. Here, probably white should take. Notice that we were attacking e4, so it was a little awkward for white to do anything else, unless they wanted to play like queen e2 or something. After c takes d5, we'll look at one critical variation here after if white comes after our bishop with knight e5. So there's one very simple move here, knight f to d7. Why knight f? Because if the other knight comes here, when we take on e5, when we're forced to, white will get this extra tempo on our knight on f6, which might be annoying. So we're challenging this knight right away, I should also mention, because white is coming in here strong with h4, h5, and if we're forced to make some sort of retreat square for our bishop, then white will take the opportunity to take on g6 and force us to take back with our f-pawn, which would really ruin our structure, give us this terrible backwards pawn. So that's why we're challenging right away. Probably white should take, and then we get this sort of position where there's a lot going on, but I'll offer one very simple construction for playing. If any of these, if the bishop is moved to any of these squares, then we can play our bishop up to b5. Probably white should start with queen to e2. Notice that there's this pin on our pawn, so the d5 pawn is now hanging. We can just break that pin, and now we just kind of play the waiting game. Where does white want to put their king, and then we'll follow suit basically. So if white goes kingside, then we'll be happy to go kingside, but if they don't, then be careful, we don't want to get attacked. If white, let's say, plays elsewhere, well, we have more constructive waiting moves than white does, because they already have their pieces out. Maybe instead of knight c6, it's also very possible to play a6. We don't want any knight coming into d6 or c7 to annoy us, so start with a6. If white goes queenside, then do hold off on going kingside, where we'll be inviting this attack. My mouse was freezing there for a second. We can play knight c6, let white think that we're hanging in the center, and maybe later play for castles. Even if we castle now, we're probably fine, especially since we can trade these bishops if we wanted. So I wouldn't worry about this position at all. We can feel very comfortable here with this bishop severely out of play. So that basically covers everything you might need to know about the individuality of the bishop c4 line. Really not a critical test, because it's just not a great square for the bishop. So instead, a much better square would be bishop to e2. Bishop e2, bishop d3 are very similar. So a lot of the ideas that are true for bishop e2 will be the same for bishop to d3. Here, the next move shouldn't surprise you, e6. And I'm going to look at castles first. I want to look at d5. d5 is a critical test of our whole plan here, because not being able to play d5 ourselves is a little bit annoying. The standard move that I'm going to suggest against pretty much all instances where white plays d5 is just to play e5, where we can then develop, let's say, quite normally, and we don't have to worry about white taking on c6, and we just always take back with the b pawn. So I'm going to look at a bunch of lines here. Probably the most critical is to take on c6. Do notice that I'm not suggesting to take before playing e5, just because it's very nice when white has this pawn here on e4. If they come after our bishop, when we come to g6, we'll have an extra tempo because we're attacking the pawn on e4, and that is very, very useful, as we'll see. So I'm suggesting the immediate e5. And yeah, I'm going to look first at he takes c6. I recommend to take back with the pawn to get the center control. Taking with the knight is possible as well, but you do have to contend with the fact that this square is very weak, and it's easy for white to play typical ideas where they pin our knight, which defends the square, and then maybe outpost the knight here. So I prefer taking back with the pawn. And here, the most accurate move is bishop to c8, where our bishop can reroute to a6. Now, not a move like bishop e6 because of knight to g5. So after a move like castles, bishop e7, bishop c4, castles, and later we can figure out pressing in the center. Maybe we can play a5, bishop a6, something of that nature, and have a pretty simple position. Now, that's probably not what you're going to see though, because before playing d5, white does have the option of playing h3, and after bishop h5, then d5. So you'll notice that we no longer have this simple bishop retreat where you have to commit to the bishop being on the g6 square. Bishop takes f3 is pretty much in all positions an inferior move, because white isn't obligated to play for e5. If white did play e5, then I think that this is absolutely fine, because we reach a very close structure where we get our typical French counterplayer. Our bad bishop is exchanged for another minor piece. But here, as long as there's a lot of tension possible in the center, I think that, like after castles, white is very comfortable here with the two bishops. Although this is still very solid, do understand that this is like committing yourself to some suffering, and I do not recommend it. It's not healthy. So, yes, I do recommend bishop to h5. Get rid of that. And here d5 is the most critical test. Now, if white castles, we'll get positions that we'll see with normal bishop e2, so I'm not going to look into that right away. This is mainly focusing on the d5 move and e5. So the critical line here is d takes c6. Also g4 is possible, and I think and castles is possible. Okay, so I'll start by looking at d takes c6. And the move I'm going to recommend here is b takes c6, because I do like the center control. I think I mentioned that once already. And it gives us a very clear plan of we'll defend this pawn and then we'll play for d5 to equalize in the center. So the most critical test of this is knight h4. Now, white could castle first, and we'll look at that in a second, because we shouldn't play. I don't think we should play bishop e7, because knight h4 is still very strong in that position, and we'll see in the immediate knight h4 positions the bishop doesn't really belong immediately on e7, because to keep the knight out of f5 we're going to play g6, and then it becomes apparent that our bishop belongs on g7. So this is kind of tricky. Let's start with the knight h5 lines, knight h4 lines, just to show what this is like. So after we take on e2, queen takes e2. This is kind of critical. We should be very precise in how we counteract all of white's threats. I like starting with g6 right away, just to control the f5 square. Now we could wait until white plays knight f5 to play g6, but that just gives white extra options of playing, maybe knight e3. We don't need to allow that, since we're going to have to basically kick the knight out once it gets played there anyways. So white's probably, the most prudent move is probably to bring the knight back. Now we can play knight to d7. We can leave our bishop here as long as possible, covering the d6 pawn until we figure out some sort of other protection for this pawn. Castles. And we have a very specific problem that we're contending with here, which is our weak dark squares. But as I'm about to show, I think we can solve that pretty nicely. So we start with queen c7, so rook d1, and rook to d8. So we're solving all of our problems here of the d6 pawn before we move our f8 bishop. So this is quite a natural plan. After, let's say, bishop e3, now we're ready to play bishop to g7. And probably white's most critical way of playing is to play for a4, where they're cutting off our knight from utilizing the b6 square in the event that they gang up on our pawn. We want to be able to move the knight to have the rook defend it. So a4 makes some sense. So we should probably throw in knight b6 ourselves. If a move like queen a6, we can play knight b6 anyways. So if a5, knight to c8. Defending everything very nicely. Next, you can see we're going to castle. After a move like queen c4, we can castle right away. Actually, we can start with rook to d7, which is a very nice move, just to rule out any sort of discover. Not really discovered either. The pawn is pinned. We don't want to have our queen get attacked. After a move like b4, just castle. And this is a pretty reasonable position. We'll work to defend our pawn on e5. We'll double rooks, and then we'll, at the right moment, we'll play for d5, making sure that our queen is not still having our c-pawn pinned, with our queen being behind it. So I will say that white is slightly better here. We couldn't avoid that, but I think this gives us good opportunity for counterplay in this position. So backing up here, that was the critical knight h4 line. So because keeping that position in mind, now it makes a lot more sense that after castles, the very natural bishop e7 is not my recommendation. You should treat these positions very carefully. I like to start with bishop to g6 because knight h4 is so strong. Now, when white spends a tempo here to defend the e4 pawn, we can play h6, and now knight h4 can always be met by bishop to h7. And we can get similar positions. And now we'll bring our bishop to e7, castle, not make illegal moves, knight to d7, and then we'll play for d5 at an opportune moment. And I think the positions are very playable. And the plan, the general strategic plan for black is very straightforward. So it should help you navigate the middle game. So what to do instead of d takes c6? What about g4? So this is the tempo I mentioned. This is why we didn't take on d5 right away. It's really nice to have this extra tempo in here. After like bishop to d3, well then we could take on c5, e takes d5, and now we never have to worry about our bishop getting harassed because we can always trade. Did I have another move in here besides bishop to d3? Yes, I did. Bishop g5 is an interesting move, pinning our knight. And I think the most simple response here is just to play h6. Bishop takes, queen takes, and I wanted to point out here that these positions can harbor some tactics. Queen to d3 is setting a little bit of a small trap for us after queenside castle. So I'm going to consider this a critical variation. Sorry, the critical trap doesn't come after queenside castle. This is just what they're also setting up. The problem is that bishop e7 is not a good move because white has this excellent knight d5 shot where our queen is unable to come back and protect squares because our bishop is in the way, and taking this gives us a huge problem of our rook hanging, which is why the best move is actually to start with a5 to give our rook some luft here. It's a tricky position, so I really want to stress the importance of looking into these lines, learning these lines. I think I found all the pitfalls here to show you, but this kind of thing is quite tricky. After a5, let's say queenside castle, then you can play a move like queen f4, king b1, knight d7. Just simple development. You can get ready to castle. When the time is right, we can clarify the tension in the center and get some queenside counterplay. It's actually not so easy for white to drum up an attack on the king side because our bishop is in the way and our queen sits in the way here of the f4 pawn. And this knight has a hard time coming to kick us away because the e4 pawn is weak. So, very playable middle game. And I think I already showed bishop to d3. Yeah, so that's what happens after g4. So that's why it's important not to start by taking on d5, but to leave the pawns in tension there. And so, one last move, castles. I like starting with bishop to g6. And bishop to g5 is interesting. Notice that it's a similar position to before, where if we play bishop e7, they have the shot d takes c6, b takes c6, and knight h4, where our bishop doesn't belong in e7. So that's why I like starting here after castles to play bishop to g6. So I chose bishop g5 as an interesting way to combat the pressure here on e4, but any other move as well, defending the e4 pawn. can play h6 after, let's say, bishop takes f6. It is more critical than, let's say, something like here. Black is already equalizing after knight to d7. Here, black is also fine. I should think. We can play for bishop e7. If we feel like our queen is going to get out of play here, we can even start back with queen coming back to d8 before bishop e7, so that our queen can sit on c7 to defend our pawn. In fact, I think I'm going to recommend that instead, but it's hard for white to, let's say, take advantage of the fact that we're underdeveloped here, because there aren't any nice ways to open up the position. When they take on c6, we take back and we have good control of the squares here, and there's no way to gang up on our d6 pawn too early. And when they play for f4, it will take them, first of all, a move or two to do that, and even if they get that exchange in, they have one open file, and our bishop is on the defending on f7. The knight, because our queen commands this file, this diagonal, the knight can't come here very easily. So although it's a little counterintuitive that all these extra moves made by black aren't punishable, I mean, just concretely, how does white get in and take advantage of the fact that we're spending some extra moves on development? So that's all the essential knowledge that you need for combating any sort of d5 break in this position or in subsequent positions. Here, and I guess that for the most part covers all of the bishop e2 variations. I have some notes here that I've taken so that I don't forget any variations. Yes, I should also mention that e5 doesn't make any sense, especially when we are able to have this tension of the queens. The knight takes e5 is probably the only playable way to proceed for white because of the queen trade if d takes e5. Here we can play knight b to d7, f4. It looks like white is able to establish some sort of grip in the center, but this isn't, I mean, f4 really isn't the best move. It's just the most interesting try. This encourages us to strike with a later c5. Not necessarily now, although I think it is possible just to start with this now. You can just play bishop e7, say castles, bishop e3 here. You can even play queen b6 or queen c7. Prepare for c5 at the right moment. So this isn't very challenging at all because white is missing their light square bishop that would be necessary to support pawn pushes in on the king side or in the center. So that pretty much covers the bishop e2 variation as a whole. Just because if we look at just castles, bishop e7, same ideas after d5. The difference being that with h3 not played already, if let's say d5 here, here we can actually play for c takes down d5 and then e5. And because our bishop isn't on h5 able to get kicked back, now if h3, we can take. So this is a very important difference actually. I was writing out this variation, but take notes on this. So this is the difference between having h3 played already and playing it here. So after bishop takes f3, just castles. a4 is an interesting way to gain space on the queen side. Knight b to d7, a5, just a6. And we're going to play for positions where we can get rid of our weak bishop by bringing it to g5, trading it off for this bishop, and play for f5. And we get very nice counterplay in the form of our pawns, gaining space here on the king side. White's left with the bad bishop because this pawn here on d5 covers up the file here, meaning that our pawn on d6 isn't that weak. It's not easy for white to attack that at all. And I can play through a few more example moves here. This has been played a couple times by strong players. A move like knight a4, you can play bishop g5. So let's say white doesn't want to trade bishops, instead leave us with our on the same color as our pawns here. But here we can still get very typical play, and here e3 was a very nice move. Also possible is just to reroute the bishop to better square, and we can use our counterplay on the king side to combat the counterplay or the play on the queen side. So very playable, interesting position that I wouldn't worry about. Whoop. Okay, so backing up here. So that's if d5 in this position. So instead of that, if a move like bishop e3, castles, I should mention, because I don't think I did, why we're not playing d5 after castles. Why are we not playing d5 in this position? And it's because there is one specific line that is a little troublesome, and that occurs after e takes d5, c takes d5, h3, and so this is the problem. Back to those positions where white had the bishop c4, bishop b3. This is like that, but more prudent for white, who has spent that time castling, and the bishop can still come to b5. And so the idea is exactly the same. They want to play h4, h5, and when we are forced to protect our bishop, they can take, and then we're forced to take back with the f-pawn, ruining our structure. So, and the other problem is that if we play any sort of knight moves here, white is castled, and gives him good time to play for f4. Knight c6 is also possible, and after bishop to b5 or some comparable move. The computer does seem to agree that these positions are holdable for black. By holdable, I mean like equal. But it's very complicated and often will involve pawn sacrifices, things I don't understand and can't recommend, where I don't really see where the compensation is coming from, things of that nature. So I'm going to recommend to avoid this entirely just because of the complicated nature of the compensation that you have to fight for. And that's why I am recommending to, before playing d5, to pin bishop e7 and castles, so that there's no problem here with bishop to b5 pinning a knight that comes to attack this knight on e5 in the event of those variations. So that brings us into some variation like this, where we get in castles, and now let's do some normal move and getting what we want. And we can see an example here of, well, first of all, we're attacking the pawn on e4. If white takes, well, hey, this is a pretty good position. And if white plays e5, once again, this is exactly the kind of position that we're aiming for. And even though there were these other pitfalls with fighting against d5 played by white, I promise you it's not very common to see that, especially at the lower levels of play, where it's just not very natural to someone who hasn't seen it before. And they're more likely to play for these French structures kind of absent-mindedly, where we get very easy play. Of course, we can trade bishops here, play for c5, f4, take, even if they played c3. Instead, notice these very simple, easy plans. White, lacking the light squared bishop, a lot of these attacks on the king side are nothing but show. Like, for an example here, f5, we can just swap things off, and we're left with a very simple position where white's attack is completely dissolved. They have a weak pawn. We do have a weak pawn as well, but we have a lot more easy play here against the pawns and the queen side. After a move like c3, in this example game, rook c4 was played, bringing the rook around, keeping pressure on this pawn, and queen sat nicely on e6. I'll just show the conclusion of this game because this is basically the typical game that we're looking to get. And already here, white, with these trades, got overextended, wasn't able to defend the pawn. notice that the rook came to here, we'd play f6. So white went down a pawn, and then we were able, I say we like I was the one playing this game. This is not my own game, but a game between a 2300 player with white and a Grandmaster 2500 player with black. King e7, and even though white got the pawn back, the king comes in and picks up the pawn, and black is pressing and ended up winning this endgame quite cleanly, with not only with the extra pawn, but the more active king and rook, making a huge difference even in this rook endgame. So that's basically the meat and potatoes of bishop e2. Let's not take 5 years to back up through the moves. I guess one other line that I could throw in here is what if they play for e5? But here you can just take, and this position kind of plays itself. Knight d5 is possible. Even if knight e4, we have control over the d6 square for now. Also possible is to play knight to d7 with pressure on the e5 pawn. And also, actually, I don't know why I'm saying all these things, because we should definitely start by taking queens. Then playing knight d5 or knight d7. In this position, you should be careful, be aware that knight can come to try to sit in here, but knight d5, playable. Knight d7, white has to do something about this pawn, and probably a move like f6 is actually very good here. Castling is probably possible as well. I think f6 is kind of prudent. We can fight back in this way. The queens are off the board, so our king doesn't mind sitting on a square like f7, and we can fight back in this way. e5 would become possible. So we're not worried about a knight coming to outpost here without being able to swap that off. Yeah, so that sums up bishop e2. And what if instead bishop d3? Well, the overlap is going to be quite apparent after e6. I guess I can show one example. I mean, basically every line that applied to bishop e2 applies to bishop to d3. I'll just show one example here. h3, bishop h5, g4. The slight difference is that now e4 isn't hanging when white comes after our bishop like this. One line could be g5. Knight h4, not possible because of knight takes c4. So knight f to d7, h4, and then we can come back bishop h5. I will say that white should still be slightly better, which is true in all the lines here, because, I mean, in general, we are playing with the black pieces and we're playing a flexible setup, so the computer is always going to throw a little weight to white, but, I mean, I wouldn't be too hesitant to play this against some sort of early expansion where we can get back on the pin here, play for d5, all of our typical stuff. Now, we should now go into the most critical lines, which occur after h3. And these are critical. I think I've said this once already. Bishop takes f3 is possible and very solid, but not recommended because it's quite a bit of suffering. Losing the bishop pair very early and trying to play some sort of solid setup. It's just not very fun to play in that way. So we should play bishop to h5. And here there are a couple moves. Now we can look at bishop e2 or bishop d3 or something again. The most critical moves are queen e2 and g4. And these two moves actually are close cousins here because you can play them in either order. The idea is that queen e2 defends the e4 pawn and makes g4 possible, and g4, bishop g6, queen e2 just transposes. So I'm going to start with the g4 move order, just because there are a couple additional possibilities, not including on queen e2. Queen e2 is the most popular in my database, but after e6, everybody plays here, and it's a direct transposition, so I'm not going to worry about that. After g4, queen e2, e6. Now, the main move is h4. A move like bishop g2 is interesting I actually found there was a game played quite a while ago. Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces. This was well before he was world championship contender level, probably around 25. Well, he's still very strong in the high 2500s, and this was also take this game with a grain of salt because it was played in an amber blindfold tournament against none other than Peter Svidler with the black pieces. So in that game, black just played simply d5. Magnus took, understanding that e5 is not ideal, allowing black to get the French structure. And there was too much pressure on the e4 pawn, so he took, played knight e5, knight c6, takes, and this position is pretty equal, especially since the bishop isn't well placed here on g2. If white castles, then the bishop has to stay here to defend the h3 pawn, and the bishop is just kind of looking at this pawn, like what's going on. So that's not critical at all. But much more critical is h4. I'm going to backtrack real quick here after bishop g6, bishop d3, defending this pawn, really nothing because this just allows e6, d5. Alright, so yeah, queen e2, e6, h4, and here both h5 and h6 are possible. I'm definitely going to recommend h5. h6 is really asking for us to get kicked around after, let's say, h5, g5. We're going to have some major weaknesses on the g file here, so that would be very unpleasant. Much stronger is h5, which is the most typical way to counteract. And white basically has to go g5, knight here, and then strongest is probably bishop to h3. There are a couple other moves here, like bishop e3 or even d5. So let's start with these less critical moves than bishop h3. Or I guess they're still kind of critical, but because you can transpose with bishop h3. So we take. This is fine because we take because our bishop is now opened up nicely. So look at the queen side. Move like bishop e3 because white's probably going to castle queen side and then chuck pawns at us on the king side. Bishop e7, here. This position, again, slightly better for white. We have some very clear ideas here of counterplay against the queen side. We have a nice semi-open file. Our knight can come to a6 here to come to b4 or c5. My mouse is freezing real quick. And white has to figure out how exactly they want to drum up the counterplay on the king side here. So if white plays very accurately, they can maintain that slight advantage. But practically, I think it's very, very playable for black and a bit uncomfortable even for white to have this be in the face of these pawn storms, where the comparable pawn storm by white is a bit harder to achieve because we can always trade for it. And then even though our bishop isn't well placed here, well, that would also allow us to play our rook out here. If our queen moves, our bishop can reroute to better pastures here, or it can just sit tight for the time being on f8. So that's a very playable position if they play for d5. If they don't play for d5, we're going to play d5 ourselves. I'll look at bishop e3 really briefly. Of course, we play d5. Let's knight to d2. And then I like this move knight a6, which is going to be typical in the bishop h3 variation as well. The idea is that the knight's coming back to c7, because when f4 is played, we're going to take on e4, and it's nice to have the knight jump into d5. So we're going to look at that in a more critical fashion with bishop h3. And this is a little more critical because notice that we can't actually play d5 at this very moment because without the bishop here, the queen still pins our pawn here after the captures on d5. And so we need to first start with bishop e7 to break that pin before playing d5. Then bishop to e3. Notice that this is almost a direct transposition. Knight a6. So let's say a move like f4. D takes e4. Knight takes. And here, this is a game between Alex Yermolinsky with white and Joel Benjamin with black. Those are two very well-known names in the United States. Joel Benjamin being I think several-time U.S. champion, and Yermolinsky being a very, very strong, I think formerly Russian, or I'm probably botching that, from somewhere in the Eastern Europe regions. Very strong in-game player and grandmaster. After, let's say, castles, you can then play bishop f5, takes, and we have a very interesting position. White does have a bit more space and coordination, but we have all the, let's say, positional trumps with square control. We have the better bishop, and our knights can route into the relevant squares. We don't have to worry about some sort of quick breakthrough with f5, because we can play queen g4. So basically the whole premise of this way of playing is to play make it impossible for white to have any sort of successful aggression where we can play for square control. And I think that's the Nf3 variation in a nutshell. That covers all of the critical stuff. Oh, speaking too soon. White doesn't have to play for g4 and queen e2. What if instead bishop e2? Well, notice that we've transposed directly into stuff that we've gotten before in d5. And in fact, yeah, definitely, yeah, start by castling. g4, d5. Notice that bishop takes e4 is not viable because of g5. After d5, takes. This is an equal position. Not too worried about the bishops here because we've been able to kingside castle very successfully with white already having castled. So the position will remain fairly closed, and the bishops won't be able to exercise any sort of attack against our king because it's safe in this position. That's the difference between, let's say, this position and other positions where we lose the bishop for the knight, and white has the the bishop pair advantage over us. So, all right, spoke too soon before, but now I think that covers all the important lines of the Nf3 variation. The takeaways are always keep in mind that we're angling for this French or Caracan light squared pawn triangle formation, where we can lose our light squared bishop and not sweat about it because we have the nice pawn structure. And I think I looked at all the critical lines where white can really try to test us on the fact that we played an early bishop g4 and c6, but we should be holding fine. Some of the middle games are a little tricky, but I think I've given enough information here to allow you to play them with good common sense and have some plans in your head already to play them successfully. And that covers one of the most important moves of the whole Czech Pirc setup. So hope you enjoyed. Make sure to look at the critical Austrian attack lines and some of the other offbeat lines so that you can play this completely confidently. And I look forward to seeing you in other videos so that you can add this wonderful tricky opening into your repertoire.